Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 410. This week the questions are taken from the 5-minute guides to the Tonnant, the French ship of the line of 1789, and Leif Erikson's Viking ship, the Wednesday videos on what exactly is a battle cruiser and the voyage of USS R14, and finally the Naval Engineering Friday video on decapping AP shell armour components in the 1920s. So let's get on with questions. B2 Tall asks, Drac, was there ever any point over the last 500 years when the overall strength of French naval forces exceeded that of overall English naval forces? Yes, on actually quite numerous occasions. So, for example, going right back to the very beginning of this 500-year period to the Tudor era, when the French threatened to invade, and that led to the Battle of the Solent, which is where Mary Rose sank, the French fleet significantly outnumbered the English fleet in that particular conflict. And as time went on from there, the strength of the two respective fleets would kind of wax and wane and overtake each other, although generally speaking the French fleet was the larger going into, say, the Stuart period, not helped by the English Civil War, where, of course, the Navy was split in two, some going with the Royalists, some remaining with the Parliamentarians. And it's only, I think, really when you get towards the very end of the Stuart period that the Royal Navy starts to have a numerical ascendancy on a relatively consistent basis, because even after the Anglo-Dutch Wars, when the Royal Navy has expanded quite considerably, you still have the French fleet being quite large. And even as you get into the 1700s, the French, for example, are building considerably more three-decker first-rates than the English, or at that point the British, are. And I think really you want to be looking at probably around about the early to mid 1700s to see the Royal Navy gradually overhaul the French Navy in terms of overall naval strength. Although, as I said, the French Navy will still have superiority in some areas like sheer numbers of first rates at points. But over the course of the 1700s, as I said, the Royal Navy initially gets ahead and then stays ahead for the most part. Not obviously for the French, it's not helped by the fact that a whole ton of the ships they build end up in British service because they keep getting captured in the various wars between Britain and France. And then, of course, once you get to the Napoleonic period, the Royal Navy has a reasonable numbers advantage and maintains that. However, during all this period, and even into the first half of the 19th century, French building capacity for warships remains very high, and to keep the French numbers down, the Royal Navy is constantly having to cull the French fleet by means of captures and destruction. And that's why, for example, you get the steam ship of the line arms race going on in the 1840s and 1850s between the British and the French, because French naval infrastructure is set up for that kind of building race. For them, it's more a matter of funding, considering they also have to fund a very large army. Then the Industrial Revolution kind of upsets all of that, but that's a separate thing. And by that point, the Royal Navy is drawn quite considerably ahead. Mr. Person asks, during the late age of sail period, what would happen to sailors who got seriously ill or injured underway? Would they be left ashore in a friendly port, or would they stick with the ship? And what if they had a key role on board, such as a carpenter or a surgeon? Generally speaking, you would remain with the ship. You'd just be put into the sickbay area and left in their care. And that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's no such thing as regular supply trips back home or back to friendly ports. So, it's not like it's going to be, oh yeah, well, in 2 weeks there'll be a ship heading back to England and you can get on that. Another factor is, well, you're probably going to be getting about the best care you can hope for where you are, because if your ship has a surgeon, well, that's about the extent of medical care you're going to get at the period without being stupidly rich. And if you're a common sailor, you aren't stupidly rich. If you got ashore and you were trying to get seen privately, the standard of medical care would cost you more and probably be of lesser quality as I said, unless you had some kind of stupendously wealthy benefactor. And even then, it's only going to be marginally better. And also, you signed up for that ship's commission. So if you left the ship early, getting paid might be quite the problem, especially if you're put ashore in a foreign port, because then you'd have to find your own way home, essentially, or pray that another warship of your navy showed up at some point and was willing to take you on board. And there'd be all sorts of interesting bureaucratic issues once you got home, working out how much pay were you owed, and when did you stop being paid as part of that ship's crew. And that could be quite dangerous for the financial position of a sailor, assuming, of course, that they survived. It's only in very rare cases that you find casualties being put off of a ship, either to a nearby port or being sent home. And when they're put off to a nearby port, it's usually to allow them some rest and recovery period, but the ship is going to come back and pick them up later on. And only in very rare cases will someone actually be sent home due to their injuries, and that will mostly be perhaps officers and so forth, and only if the opportunity arises. So most of the time you'd stick with a ship because, as I said, you're not really going to get any better care anywhere else, and you'll probably get worse care, so you might as well stay. C. Babylon asks, I'm not sure if this has been asked before, but when was the first rifle-bored cannon used on age-of-sail vessels, and by which country? So the answer to that is the French. They were the first to develop rifle-bored heavy artillery. The patents for that were filed in the early 1840s, although from a write-up I can find from 1877, it seems that although they had investigated and confirmed that yeah, it works, it doesn't immediately explode, the Marine Nationale wasn't that interested in taking things any further until the Crimean War, presumably because, well, there wasn't really a huge amount of naval conflict that France got involved with in between the early 1840s and, well, the Crimean War, which only starts around about a decade later. And at that point, the Marine Nationale goes, well, we do have a lot of Russians to shoot at. Might as well take some of those experimental rifled guns with us and see if that works any better than the smoothbore stuff. And by all accounts, the guns in question were, roughly speaking, 32-pounders, but built up in 64, 68-pounder size guns. So there was an inserted rifled section, which was quite thick. It's quoted as usually being about 160 centimetre caliber. And that was the first use of rifle-bored cannon. Of course, there had been experiments with rifling smaller guns in the past to varying degrees, but in terms of naval heavy artillery, this appears to be the first time. Almirante Brown asks, the book French Battleships 1922-56 mentions a water-excluding rubber compound called Ebonite Mousse that was used to fill voids in the hull of the Dunkirk and Richelieu-class battleships. Do you have a picture of this material? How much of the displacement of those respective warships was taken up by Ebonite Mousse? And what are your thoughts on the pros and cons of filling hull voids with buoyant materials like cork or Ebonite Mousse? Was there a period in the age of steam and steel where this technique was worth the trouble of installation, maintenance and weight? I don't have any photos of actual French naval Ebonite Mousse, unfortunately, but it's basically a rubber foam with a bit of gum mixed in, so find a big brick of black rubber foam and rip it open or cut it open or whatever. And that's basically what Ebonite Mousse looks like. And it was used specifically in the torpedo defence system of the Dunkirks and Richelieus. So as you probably know, the standard torpedo defence system was a mixture of liquid and void layers, with the idea being that the void layers would allow the expansion and thus dissolution of the shockwave because it spreads out over a wider area, whereas the liquid layers are better suited to absorbing the actual physical torpedo fragments themselves, and so you need alternating layers. Now, one of the problems with this system is, of course, if a torpedo blows through one or more of your void spaces, those void spaces now get filled with water, quite a lot of water, and the ship starts to heel over, even if the torpedo defense system has actually done its job, you're still going to end up with something of a list. And since there's a socking great hole in the side of the ship, you can't exactly pump that area out. You can maybe seal off and pump out some ancillary compartments up and down the void system, but even then that's going to be quite difficult. The best thing you can do is counterflood, but then you have even more water in your ship. So different navies at points investigated and occasionally implemented potential ways to try and solve this. So HMS Hood, for example, filled its void spaces with crush tubes, so essentially things that look like gigantic scaffolding poles except capped at either end. This actually also had a shock absorption property as well as the other main property, which was that hopefully only some of them would be breached, therefore you would only get some flooding, and the rest of them, by physically occupying volume and being a little bit buoyant, would mean that a hit in any particular part of the torpedo defense system didn't result in as much water and as much loss of buoyancy. The French went with the idea of this Ebonite Mousse, the idea being not so much blast absorption, because after all it's foamed rubber, it doesn't have a huge amount of blast absorption when you're comparing it to several hundred kilos of explosive in a torpedo. But the idea was that by filling the void spaces with this, because it was foamed, you still had void. The foam rubber is very compressible. Therefore, you still had the effect of spreading out and dissipating the blast. But when that blast finally dissipated, in theory, only the Ebonite Mousse that had been directly destroyed or blown out by the explosion would be replaced by water, and therefore the amount of flooding would be minimal, because everything else in that big void compartment that otherwise normally would have flooded, well, the Ebonite Mousse would still be there, so it couldn't flood because there was something in the way. It was generally deployed in bricks. There were some drawbacks to the system. Obviously, it's foamed rubber. It's a somewhat flammable in and of itself. When they were repairing damage to, I believe it was Dunkirk after Mers Kabir, they found that if you used cutting torches, you could set the stuff on fire if you were cutting into the compartment, which was a bit annoying. Also, if it got impregnated with oil, it became extremely flammable, which wasn't a brilliant thing. But then again, you're talking about what would otherwise be the void spaces of a torpedo defense system. If you have oil getting into those areas in any significant amount, you probably have larger issues than the fact it's now also become flammable. But as for the effect on displacement, I don't know exactly what the displacement of the ship would be made up of Ebonite Mousse, but it's not going to be a huge amount, because Ebonite Mousse has a density about the same as very large corrugated cardboard, something around about 0.1 to 0.4. And when I say corrugated cardboard, I mean like, those big inch thick packing sections that you sometimes get in particularly heavy duty boxes. So you'd be able to fill fairly large volumes, like say the void spaces, without really adding a massive amount of weight to the ship. Not the Kremlin asks, if the Italian Navy had been properly led, could it have driven the English from the Mediterranean? People tend to forget the Italian Navy was larger than either the French or British Mediterranean fleets, at least by the late 1930s. I think there's kind of two phases to that. Could they have driven the British from the Mediterranean completely? No, I don't think so. And that's simply because to fully drive the Royal Navy from the Mediterranean, you'd have to make the fleet bases at Gibraltar and Alexandria non-viable, and the Italian Navy trying to exert its influence at those two extreme ends of the Mediterranean probably isn't going to go very well, because obviously it's home field defender's advantage for the Royal Navy, including things like submarines, but also land-based air power, choke points, minefields, and it's beyond the range of near enough all the Italian Air Force's aircraft, and thanks to a particular fight between the Regia Aeronautica and the Regia Marina, much like the fight between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, the Italians had no aircraft with their fleet aside from scout aircraft like the one you can see in the foreground here. So they didn't have any organic carrier support or anything, and I don't think you want to have a good chunk of the Desert Air Force turn their attention on you when you're 100 miles off Alexandria if you have no actual fighter support. That's not a recipe that's going to end very well for you at all. But in terms of could they have established control of the greater portion of the Mediterranean, i.e. cut off supply to Malta completely, and maybe if you split the Mediterranean into quarters, occupied and essentially dominated the two central quarters, and obviously then you just leave the bit around Alexandria and Gibraltar to the British. That, yes, in theory they could have done. It would have required quite a number of changes. For example, you would have needed, since you don't have carriers, you would have needed actually quite good relations and coordination with the Regia Aeronautica. The lack of coordination between those two parties was one of the big problems that the Regia Marina faced in its various campaigns against Admiral Cunningham, obviously with the Mediterranean fleet. But even then, you are still going to face a problem that Cunningham has carriers and you don't, so he has more proximate strike and fighter assets that he can bring to bear. Although, again, as a mixture of Flieger Corp 10 and Regia Aeronautica assets showed, it was possible to knock back various British carriers, damage armoured carriers forced their withdrawal. Obviously, HMS Eagle got sunk by Axis submarines, etc. So if you had much more dedicated coordination with the air forces, and you played your cards slightly differently when it came to fleet deployments, you would need to win a couple of set-piece battles to inflict enough losses to force the British to withdraw, but you in theory could do so. The Italians do have enough capital units to do that, which is, of course, one of the major reasons why the British launched Taranto, to stop the Italians doing that. But you do also have to bear in mind that all of this is operating under the much larger shadow of, yes, you have lots of battleships, but are they all ready at the same time? Combined with, do you actually have the fuel to run them all at the same time? Which is a problem that gets obviously worse and worse as time goes on during the Italian involvement in the Second World War. So, yeah, better admirals early on. So some of the later war Italian admirals being there right from the start, combined with strong coordination with the air forces, plus maybe continuing development on radar instead of pausing it, which is what they did historically. So you actually then have radar for a decent portion of the Mediterranean conflict. And honestly, hand waving away, where are you going to find enough oil? Put all of that together, maybe massively stockpile it before the war or something. And there certainly are scenarios where the Regia Marina could have forced the British out of the central Mediterranean on a fairly prolonged basis. But that relies on everything coming up heads for the Italians and everything coming up tails for the British. So possible, but not tremendously likely in the long term. Bjornstern Fors asks, how did the Norse manage to regularly sail between Norway and Iceland? How did they navigate? From Iceland to Norway, I guess you just had to keep sailing east till you reached the Norwegian coast, but how did they reliably go back the other way? Well, they had a combination of factors. For a good chunk of the Viking Age, if you like, they actually had occupation of the Faroe Islands, which were a useful stop-off point if you needed food, water, repairs, or rest. They also knew roughly what the persistent weather, current, etc. conditions were along the route. So they could say, well, when the current runs this way, okay, you're in the right area. If it changes to this at this time of year, then you've gone the wrong way. You need to go port to starboard, etc. They also did a fair bit of celestial navigation they sort of, although they didn't have a concept of latitude as we would understand it, as in, lines on a map, north, south pole, etc. They understood the concept of latitude as in, if you sail further south, the sun gets higher at its zenith. If you sail further north, the sun is lower. And if you sail and the sun is consistently at the same height, that means you are going directly east or west. They knew this. You could also use the stars for that to a limited degree, but the sun they considered was somewhat more useful. So they would sail, and when they sailed, they would go, okay, well, we know that to get to Iceland, we want the sun to be roughly at this point on its zenith, because that is the level that Iceland is at. And so if you are leaving Norway, then you would first sail north or south along the coast until you reached that point. And then you'd strike out and you'd hope as you went along each day, you'd go, okay, well, today the sun is slightly higher than it should be, so we need to sail a bit further north, or today the sun is lower than it should be, so we need to sail a little bit further south. You're essentially trying to keep it to a fixed point in keeping with when you left. And if it was overcast, there was this whole thing about sunstones, which there was a lot of debate in the 20th century as to what they were, did they exist, etc. But it does seem that more recently there's been discoveries that show that actually, yes, these sunstones probably did exist, and essentially the idea would be to use them because they polarize light. You would use them to work out where the sun is, because of course when they're pointed at the sun, even over through clouds, the polarization effect becomes far more apparent. I mean, it's not exactly the same mechanism, but if you're on a fairly bright but overcast day, you can tell where the sun is roughly simply by looking at the clouds, because you'll look around at the clouds and then you'll look at a bit of the clouds and suddenly you'll be like, oh, ow, that's really bright, even though to a general observer the clouds might look all the same. And that's because you are looking at the sun just through the filter of the clouds, and that slight pickup in intensity is enough to trigger your reaction. Also, on similar days or even duller days, if you're standing outside, if you just close your eyes lightly rather than scrunching them up and you look around, obviously you can't see anything because your eyes are closed, but if you look at the sky and pan your head around, you will notice that when you're looking in a particular direction at a particular elevation, it suddenly seems like that direction is brighter than everywhere else. And that's, again, because that's where the sun is. And although, as I said, with the sunstones, they're using polarization, so it's not just a direct look and feel device. It's essentially a similar or tangentially similar principle of the sun is in that direction. We can't directly perceive it, but we can use this technique to amplify what light there is, in that particular case with polarization, to give us a more precise bearing. And that way, even if you're sailing and on day 3, 4, and 5, it's overcast, you can still get a reasonable idea that you're on the right latitude. Asuka asks, "Hi Drac, a couple of years ago you did a video on World War II era naval guns and how they measured up to each other. I was wondering, how did the Italian and German 15-inch guns of World War I, as found in the Bayeux and to be installed on the Caracciolos, compare with the British 15-inch 42 in this regard? And are you still considering doing a video like the World War II one for World War I guns?" Yeah, a comparison of World War I naval guns is on the table, although I have a feeling I'm probably going to have to split it into two groups, because obviously the 11 and 12-inch guns are going to be completely overshadowed by the 13.5, 14, 15-inch and arguably 16-inch if we go that far guns. So I think I might end up doing it in two separate tables, probably in the same video, but kind of like, here is the table for dreadnought guns, 11 and 12-inch guns, and now here is a separate table showing the super dreadnought guns, and that'll probably be a slightly fairer way of comparing things. Now, with regards to the 15-inch guns, the British actually did quite an evaluation of the Bayern and Baden type 15-inch German gun against their own 15-inch 42, and that was quite interesting. One of the main points that came out of that was that the wire-wound 15-inch 42 was considerably heavier than the German hooped 15-inch gun, and indeed also the Italian. So the German is the lightest, weighing around about 80 tons. The Italian gun weighs around about 85 tons. The British gun weighs just over 100. But the British noted that their gun had considerably higher safety factors than the German. The safety factors on the German gun were low enough that the British was essentially going, and we would not have accepted a gun that lightly built. The Germans obviously did, but how that would have related it to long-term service, durability, and a lack of self-destruction, who knows. The guns actually do have quite different muzzle velocities. The Italian gun at just under 2,300 feet per second actually has the slowest muzzle velocity, which might be a surprise to those of you who are used to the hyper-velocity Italian World War II guns. Then you have the 15-inch 42 at just over 2,450 feet per second, and then the German guns, which fire the fastest in terms of muzzle velocity at just over 2,600 feet per second. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this maps to range. So at 20 degrees elevation, for example, the Italian gun has a range of about 21,500 yards, give or take. The British gun has a range of around about 23,500 yards, give or take. And the German gun has a range of just under 25,400 yards. Although, interestingly enough, it's actually the British gun that has by far the best armour penetration. So, for example, at about 20,000 yards, the British gun is rated at about 12 inches of penetration. The Italian gun is just a little bit less. And the German one, despite having the longest range and the highest muzzle velocity, is actually trailing quite a bit with around about 11, just over 11 inches of penetration. And the reason for that is the German gun has substantially lighter shells. Their APC shells are about 1,650 pounds as compared to just over 1,900 pounds for the British, and somewhat more, about 1,950 for the Italian. Brendan Buersdorf asks, what are the benefits of concrete armour? I've seen in your Unryu carrier video the Japanese are trying to use it to prevent shock damage to their aviation fuel tanks. And this got me curious. If concrete was good against shock damage, could it be a useful component in a torpedo defense system or as a secondary armor layer to catch splinters and shock waves? So if particularly you're trying to prevent shock or blast damage, like say you're trying to guard your aviation fuel tanks, concrete can have certain advantages. It's an incredibly rigid material, which means that its initial response to blast and shock is going to be just to reflect it away. It's one of the many reasons why concrete bunkers are concrete. But if it can't do that, and the energy that's being transmitted in the concrete is still quite substantial, then because it is rigid and brittle, relatively speaking, we're not talking glass brittle here, but it's not ductile like steel, its next response will be to fracture. And as the shockwave moves through the concrete, because of course concrete is an aggregate material, it contains aggregate, but it is an aggregation because it contains also sand and cement and so forth. Thus, there isn't a kind of, if you like, a straight path for the shockwave. It's going to be running into the various components, so that breaks up the effect somewhat. But then still, if it's a very, very powerful shockwave, it will force fractures, and of course to break something requires quite a considerable amount of energy, and that further reduces the energy that finally gets through. So this is why it's a somewhat useful thing to protect things like aviation fuel tanks. A distant explosion is relatively unlikely to do all that much to a well encapsulated fuel tank that's got lots of concrete around it. Now, could you use it in a torpedo defense system, perhaps instead of the liquid layer? And bear in mind, the liquid layer is mostly there to catch fragments and so forth. Yes, in theory, you could. However, the problem is that most concrete is about 2.5 times the density of water, so that would be an awful lot of mass that you'd be putting into the ship for, okay, some better torpedo blast absorption capability. But then the flip side is, of course, if the fragments and the shockwave pass through a liquid layer and then go into the next void layer, you'll have a breach, but then beyond that, the water probably doesn't do all that much other than partially flood the void layer. Whereas with concrete, obviously, if the torpedo explosion is powerful enough, it's going to be propelling massive chunks of concrete through with it, which that's going to be quite bad for the interior of the vessel. So between the mass and that fracturing nature, not such a good idea to directly try and cold stop a torpedo. Similarly, if you're using it as a secondary armor layer to catch splinters and shockwaves, it has absorption capabilities, but it is also going to crack and spool quite a lot compared to something that's a little bit more flexible, like, say, wood, which was very often used even in World War I and World War II. Crazy Macro asks, you mentioned Citadel Buoyancy. Was there any case where a ship was lost with an intact citadel, or one where it survived with only the citadel unbreached? Or was it just seems like a good idea thing? Now, the problem with this kind of thing is that if a ship is going to be so thoroughly battered as to be at the point of sinking, usually something breaches the citadel at some point. And, the chances that a ship gets completely riddled, and I say completely riddled at both ends, with just the citadel intact is relatively minimal because, if you've got the firepower to completely riddle both ends of the ship, you've probably also got the firepower to put holes in the citadel itself. Certainly once torpedoes come along. And if a ship survives with its citadel intact and some of the external compartments also intact, well, that doesn't count as the vessel surviving with only the citadel intact, and that's far more common for ship survival. But if you want an example where an unbreached citadel went a very long way towards saving the ship, well, Seydlitz, as seen here, is probably actually an extremely good example, because if you actually look at the flooding diagrams, although she was considerably flooded both forward and along her sides, those compartments are pretty much all external to the citadel. Granted, at the very end, you do have some bulkhead collapses and breaches, and you do get some water intrusion into portions of the citadel, but the vast majority of Seydlitz's ability to get home, like this, as you can see, is down to basically two things. One, the citadel is unbreached, and the buoyancy is keeping her up, generally, and two, the torpedo flat, for the most part, remains unbreached, and that acts as like a little buoyancy aid up front, which stops what happened to Lutzow, which is essentially you end up so nose-heavy that regardless of the fact you're technically positively buoyant, your stern comes out of the water, you can't go anywhere, and then progressive flooding also gets into the citadel, and down you go. In terms of a ship that was lost with an intact citadel outside of direct combat, though, HMS Victoria would be one of the closest, because she went down by the bow and then started to heel over without the citadel itself, as far as I recall, actually being breached. The engine room, the boiler rooms, and I think the forward magazine weren't flooded until basically the very last minute, i.e. she got to a point where her main deck was at least partially underwater, and then water flowed down into the citadel from those points, flooding it, and down she went. But she was reduced to that condition, at a point where she probably would have rolled over and sunk anyway, without the citadel being breached. And that kind of actually highlights one of the problems when you're examining ship sinkings, because weirdly, if you'd poked a hole in the opposite, so in the port aft section of Victoria, she may well have been salvaged. It was the fact that you had intense localized flooding that caused her both to pitch nose down, which started to bring the propellers out of the water, and also caused her to heel heavily to one side. That was the big problem, and that you see that with a lot of other ships that sink, because that heavy point localized flooding allows upper portions of the ship, which aren't watertight, to be breached, and then the water pours down into the otherwise sealed sections, which is why counterflooding becomes a thing as time goes on. Whereas, of course, a ship that was lost with only an intact citadel, i.e. had flooding everywhere else, would in theory at least be floating relatively evenly in the water, if somewhat lower. Blaze asks, this 1920s British armour scheme, that's the I-3's decapping armour scheme, seems somewhat similar to that of Yamato, except Yamato didn't have a decapping system. What were the pros and cons of this type of scheme? I imagine weight saving, as the belt could be somewhat shorter, and having a sloped main belt always helps. The advantages of this kind of system were that obviously you've got a sloped belt, so that increases the effectiveness of the belt against long-range gunfire. It also means that the armour belt can be made fairly regularly with fairly standardized components, whereas if with an external mounted belt, you have to kind of match the armour to the profile of the hull at any given point, which isn't too bad in the middle of the ship, but as you get towards either end, it becomes significantly more complicated. And of course, if the decapping system works, then it gives you the space without having to do any kind of particularly fancy filling, although in this case they put light filled tubes in just as part of the torpedo defense system. But you have the space to actually decap the shell, pretty much guaranteed. And if you get the angle right, then in theory you actually also save weight on the armour belt, because although it is slightly longer, because it's obviously at an angle, you can have the armour belt somewhat thinner than you'd need a vertical belt to be. Obviously, if you get the angle too shallow, then you have the slightly extended belt, and you probably need the same or almost the same thickness, at which point you lose any weight savings, and it might even be heavier. In terms of disadvantages, well, as you can see, you do need a slightly thicker deck armour for where you've got the angled deck armour, although of course you could solve that by just having it run continuously flat or horizontal, although of course that would then mean you'd save weight there, but you'd lose weight. Well, you'd gain weight, but you'd lose weight savings having to extend the belt up to that point. Also, maintenance of the armour belt is quite difficult because, of course, it's now interior to the structure of the ship. So if you want to do anything to it, you have to open up the exterior of the ship. Any hit is going to cause flooding if it's anywhere near the waterline. Obviously, with exterior armour, if it's hit and it rejects the shell, then you don't get flooding. Whereas with this, you punch holes in the relatively thin outer hull plating. That's a path for flooding to come in, regardless of whether or not the armour actually stops the shell getting in any further. Also, because of the angle, you do have to extend the armour down a fair way, so it can interfere with the torpedo defence system somewhat. And of course, you are reducing the overall internal volume of the Citadel, which means if you want to have positive Citadel buoyancy, you are going to have to extend the Citadel somewhat more, which may again mitigate some of the weight savings. And again, depending on the size of the ship and how you do the armament, of course, but you may also end up with, since the armour belt is internal to the ship, you may end up with that armour belt being uncomfortably close to something like, say, your barbettes. TB1271 asks, if, when the treaties were being negotiated, for whatever reason, the signatories agreed that all ships that had been ordered could be completed, who would have been the happiest and who would have been the most annoyed with their negotiator team? What do you think a second treaty would look like, given how many extra fast capital ships existed? Well, if they're going to allow that many large fast capital ships to be built, they're going to have to redraft the 35,000 ton and 16-inch gun limit, because otherwise everyone's going to be building lots of ships well in excess of that. But obviously then London 1, etc., are going to have to adapt to these increased size limits as well, and it would be very difficult to argue them down because these ships will be so much more powerful. In terms of who's going to be the most annoyed and who's going to be the happiest, I think it's going to be very diametrically split between the governments and the navies, because theoretically, from a naval perspective, the winner from this is the United States, because all 6 Lexingtons and all 6 South Dakotas are not only ordered, as you can see here, they're also under construction. So the US Navy gets 12 capital ships, 12 very big capital ships, including its first battle cruisers. The Japanese actually come in second, theoretically, because they have the 2 Tosas, the 4 Amagis, and then this is where it gets a bit difficult. Depending on your definition of ordered, also potentially the keys that they can build, which is going to give them a fairly large, substantial modern fleet. Although obviously with all these modern ships being built, exactly which ships are going to be scrapped is probably going to change as well. And based on what was going on historically, the Royal Navy, of course, would come up the shortest because they'd only get the 4 G3s. The flip side to that is, of course, the US government, which wants to massively cut down on naval spending, is going to be exceptionally annoyed with its negotiating team because they've now got to continue paying for 12 massive capital ships, which, they're not going to be particularly happy about. I deeply suspect that if it looks like this is the way that the negotiations are going, the Royal Navy, realizing that even the Japanese have more modern capital units on order at that point in time than they do, probably quickly slaps an order in for the N3s just so that they can say on paper, much like the keys, well, look, paper-wise we have ordered them, therefore we get to build them, which will give the Royal Navy 8 ships, which they'd probably still argue, if the Americans building 12, for the right to build another 4. What exactly those will look like, who knows? And the really interesting thing is you're going to have a very, very different set of fleets, because whereas historically the post-Washington fleets essentially went, okay, some people have battle cruisers, great, and apart from Hood, they're all relatively poorly protected, and everybody else has battleships, which are varying degrees of the low 20s of knots. Whereas in this scenario, you've got G3 and arguably possibly Key, which are definitely fast battleships. You've got the Amagis, which are somewhat well protected but very heavily armed battle cruisers. You've got the Tosas, which would be somewhat lightly protected but heavily armed battleships. You'd have the Lexingtons, which are incredibly fast battle cruisers but basically have no armour worth mentioning in a capital ship engagement. And then you have the South Dakotas and the N3s, which are the slowest of the pack, but also by far the most heavily armed and protected. Alex Cheng asks, during the period the channel covers, has there been a shipbuilding crisis similar to the one that the US and UK are facing now? And what factors, if any, are similar between these scenarios? Without commenting too much on what may or may not be happening with British and American shipbuilding at the moment, in part because obviously it's not the time period the channel covers, and also, to be honest, in part because I haven't dug deeply enough into it to have massively informed commenting, except on some very key headline issues. There were periods during the time period the channel covers where various nations faced significant shipbuilding crises. Now, admittedly, some of them, like, say, the Germans in World War II, were mostly because they were cut off from a number of key outside resources and they were constantly being bombed, which didn't help. Also, British shipbuilding in World War II was somewhat hampered by the fact the Luftwaffe kept showing up and dropping explosive presents on them. But in peacetime, in the, let's say, mid to late 1930s, there was a shipbuilding crisis in Britain that was caused by a number of different factors. Obviously, Britain wanted to rearm and build more ships. However, various schemes during the interwar period, some led by the Treasury, some led by a rather, I personally think, traitorous government department that was specially set up that actively was decommissioning shipyards all the way through up until 1938, and the simple fact that the treaty system had massively reduced the demand for naval craft of all shapes and sizes, meant that there was, in theory, the will and potentially, if you could beat up enough Treasury people, the money to build and reconstruct a whole bunch of warships. However, there was limited dockyard space, and, more critically for the larger ships, the armour and gun manufacturing capability of Britain had dropped dramatically compared to what it was capable of in the 1910s, to the point that it was calculated that as it stood in the mid-1930s, Britain could build 2 battleships a year. And that was it. Contrast that to the 1900s, before World War I, when there were over a dozen capital ships of various descriptions under construction at various British yards simultaneously. The throttle at that point wasn't strictly slipway space, although there was a certain amount of limitation on slipway and dockyard space, and obviously in World War II carriers were competing for those slots as well. But the single biggest drawback was the gun and armour manufacturers. They simply couldn't produce enough heavy guns and enough heavy armour to keep pace with more than 2 ships. Now, that did lead to a whole load of investment in the industry to try and rebuild that capability. And after a few years, because this is a fairly large set of industrial capabilities that you have to rebuild, it was decided that the armour manufacturing industry was now capable of supporting the construction of up to 3 battleships a year, and work would be ongoing on that. But work on gun manufacturing was lagging a bit further behind, and that is what led directly to the Vanguard class program, which ultimately just resulted in HMS Vanguard, but the original intention was that Vanguard would use the turrets from Glorious and Courageous along with the guns, which obviously would mean that that circumvented the limitations on big gun manufacturing. But then as the Lion class program progressed, and that you would then have 2 Lions built per year plus a Vanguard, as a third vessel, then the Revenge class would start to come in for decommissioning and scrapping, and their armament would be taken off, subject to the same modernisation as Vanguard's turrets had been, and transplanted wholesale onto the new Vanguard-class battleships. That will probably be the proximate and largest shipbuilding bottleneck that occurred. There are various smaller shipbuilding bottlenecks you get during World War II over in the States. For example, with the production of gearing sets for turbines, it's not really a huge problem to build the turbines, but the gearing sets take a lot longer, and that's why you end up with diesel-powered ships, turbo-electric drive ships, even vertical triple expansion engine-powered ships at the smaller scale of things, including escorts and Liberty ships, simply because they can't manufacture enough turbine gearing sets for all the ships the US wants to build. And towards the end of the war, there are also limitations with things like how much steel is available, which is one of the reasons the Alaska class are delayed. And similarly, when it comes to fine optics and other small gears, there's a limitation on how fast you can build the fire control systems, which is one of the reasons why the refitted and modernized standard class ships tend to be equipped with cruiser grade fire control systems, because those systems had already been ordered for a bunch of Cleveland class light cruisers, and then a bunch of them were cancelled to be turned into Independence class aircraft carriers. Obviously didn't need their 6-inch main battery fire control systems, and those were transplanted into the standard class battleships. As for drawing similarities, well, you can probably draw a reasonable number of similarities from the practical engineering side of things, but I would say there's probably a very big gulf between then and now in terms of the political side of things, because at least back then there was a general acknowledgement that you needed ships and you needed them yesterday, therefore money would be made available. It was just a matter of applying that in the right places, and the fact that some industries physically could only expand at a certain rate no matter how much money you threw at them. Whereas these days it seems to be more along the lines of, well, our mates and special interest groups need that money more, so we're going to funnel that money over to them. And of course, the defence industrial complex also needs its money to pad out everybody's executive bonuses and so forth. And we'll just kind of go along with whatever they say, which is completely the wrong way of going about it. You know, if you need a significant naval build-up, the industry adapts to what the government requires. The government does not adapt its build program to what the industry says it's comfortable with doing. Dave Collier asks, given the upcoming visit of the Bayeux Tapestry to London, what does the tapestry tell us about the Norman ships and how William built and organised his fleet? And also, are you going to see it? So yes, I do plan to see it, and I have actually reached out to the British Museum to ask if I can do a kind of a special preview thing like I did with the Legion Roman exhibit that they did. So we'll see how that pans out. Ships do appear several times in the Bayeux Tapestry. This is a section that depicts the crossing of the Channel and the landing of the Norman forces. And obviously my full observations would be obviously pending showing you all the different sections of ship construction and ship use in the Bayeux Tapestry. But what I can tell you overall is that it does show the existence of smaller ships' boats as well as larger ships. Not just these little ones in the background, but actually in an earlier scene, you can actually see a ship's boat being towed by a ship. You also have ships equipped with sails, ships that don't have sails or masts or don't seem to, ships that have these intricate prows and others that don't, ships that, as you can see here, have oarlock holes and others that don't, although some that don't have the oarlock holes do have people rowing them, which would imply perhaps ships that are, in the case of the ones that don't have rowlock holes at all, are perhaps larger cargo type vessels, so Nar descendant type vessels, which aren't really relying all that much on oars, and perhaps also the existence of much smaller vessels with sail power, but so small that they don't need extensive rowlocks, whereas the ships with the figureheads, the rowlocks or holes and the sails, these would be more of the warships, although as you can see they are also being used to transport horses in these cases. You also have obviously ships with shields lined up alongside them, although it does seem again that the shields are mounted inside the ship but over the gunnels to a degree, which would make sense given the Normans have the kite shields as opposed to the semi-traditional depiction of Vikings with round shields stuck outside of the hull. And as I said, there is certainly a certain sense that some of these vessels are considerably larger than others, even if they are portrayed most of the time at relatively similar sizes. You can also see quite prominently steering oars are still very definitely a thing. There's not really any rudders to be seen. We're still looking at single-masted vessels. There's no multi-masted vessels, fore and aft sails or anything like that. Of course, you do have to be a little bit careful when trying to draw extreme details out of things, because after all, this is, quote-unquote, only a tapestry. So there is going to be a certain degree of artistic license taken in the depictions by the people who stitched it, although then again, obviously, it is a relatively period piece, so you've got to balance that with the fact that these people probably had a fairly decent idea of what they were actually looking at, although how exactly they turn that into a depiction is, of course, a little bit, up to subjective interpretation. And I think if I do get a chance to go and give you a little preview and close-up look at the Bayeux Tapestry, then I will probably also be talking quite a lot about the overall background of the ships, the Saxon ships, the Norman ships, where they came from, and the general historical context of them. Now, this is quite an interesting part where they are landing, and as you can see, horses are coming ashore, but you can also see on this ship adjacent to the horses that are being brought ashore, they're actually stepping down the mast, which informs quite an interesting capability. Because, of course, in later periods, ships' masts were supposed to stay in place unless you've got a massive mast crane in a dock to lift them in and out, whereas in this case, this is very much something that can be taken up and down by some of the crew, which would make ship handling perhaps somewhat easier, especially when you're in a very coastal environment and you don't want to be blown about by the wind. And then you can see there's a whole bunch of ships, presumably with their masts already stepped down, which are establishing the beachhead there. So hopefully more to come on that at some point in the future if I get an email back from the British Museum. David B. asks, during the 1890s through 1950s, would it have been feasible to fit warships with deck maintenance hatches large enough to allow upgrade of their machinery plant, like boilers and turbines, to make upgrading them easier? I understand there are issues with structural weakening and armouring that would have made it difficult to solve this engineering problem. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not really a possibility for warships of the time period that you mentioned, except with maybe the exception of carriers, partly because they have fairly large lifts for weaponry that go quite deep into the ship, but even then they don't really do it. Now, this is Dreadnought under construction, and it kind of illustrates the problem, because the boilers and the machinery go in the bottom part of the ship, but you can see this kind of arched construction that's going on at what's currently the top level of the ship, with a bunch of planks laid lengthways on it. That is the level of the armoured deck. Now, obviously you have to protect your machinery with belt, but also with the armoured deck, and you can see the spacing of the beams required to support the armoured deck. There isn't anywhere in that allows you to eliminate large amounts of those beams to put in a large enough hatch to get things like boilers and turbines through, because these are pretty big chunks of machinery. Now, admittedly, yeah, the turbines are slightly smaller than the boilers, but they're still not small. And it's not just a case of putting a hatch in the armoured deck, and that would weigh, a hatch big enough to fit this machinery through, or at least big chunks of it through, with armour on it would weigh an absolutely ridiculous amount. But that aside, you'd also be talking about installing the same size hatch through multiple deck levels all the way up to the upper deck. And then you face another problem, which is that at the upper deck level, depending on exactly which ship you're looking at, you're going to have the superstructure, potentially gun turrets, also, if you're talking about the boiler area, funnels, etc. in the way, all taking up that space. And those things you can't really put hatches through. So the whole thing becomes implausible just based on that, never mind, fitting multiple very large square or rectangular weak points into the ship all the way through. What some ships did do, however, was to provide areas that were large enough to pull the machinery out, but they understood that in order to do this, you were going to be cutting down a fair bit for the most part, of the upper superstructure, although exactly how much and if at all depended on exactly what you're pulling out and where it was on the specific class of ship. But what they would do is they would put essentially pre-positioned cut points and lines. So you wouldn't compromise the strength of the vessel while it was generally in service, but if you did need to go in and pull out an entire boiler or whatever, there were specific areas where they'd essentially built the ship in such a way that once you'd cut off the relevant section of the superstructure or whatever, you could then go in and you'd have a much easier time of cutting out this specific section, lifting it out, repeating the process down several decks, pulling out the machinery, replacing it, and then putting everything back and reattaching it, as opposed to just having the ship built, assuming that you weren't ever going to need to do that, in which case it would be a much more difficult effort to select exactly where and how you're going to cut through. Elliot W. James asks, in the period 1880 through 1904, didn't any naval architects or commentators identify problems with the extreme tumblehome design of capital ships on likely ship stability in combat? And if not, why not? There was certainly some concern in various naval architectural fields about the amount of tumblehome, but you've got to remember that while having extreme tumblehome and then flooding during combat results in extreme instability and you go over very fast, like poor old Bouvet here, the tumblehome was in part also an attempt to improve ship stability. Now, granted, with a lot of French ships, because of their habit of having wing-mounted barbette guns, they did also use it to provide a head and a stern fire at various points. But another major element of tumblehome, which is why you also see it in things like the Royal Sovereign class, is to minimize the amount of structure that is significantly above water, and therefore, if you reduce top weight, you improve a ship's stability. Now, in some cases that's more successful than others because, of course, you're also reducing the upper deck area, which means if you need a certain amount of superstructure, it's got less area to go over, which then means the superstructure is built higher, and hence you get some of the floating hotels, and then you start to question whether or not it was actually all worth it in the first place. But nonetheless, what the tumblehome allowed was it allowed you to have relatively high freeboard ships with the technology of the time without compromising on their general peacetime stability, or should we say undamaged stability. It was known that if you then had severe flooding on one side of the ship, this had the potential to cause massive stability issues, which could then cause the ship very rapidly to capsize. But there were two primary ways of trying to deal with that. Firstly was obviously trying to armour the ship in such a way that you wouldn't take massive catastrophic flooding at that kind of level, which is, among other reasons, one of the reasons why a lot of French pre-dreadnoughts had incredibly thick but very narrow or shallow belts concentrated around the waterline, specifically to just ensure against all possible hope that you didn't get flooding in those places. But also, there was a lot of discussion about the system of bulkheads that would be used, because you might be tempted to put in longitudinal bulkheads, that is, fore to aft bulkheads, because that would divide the ship up into lots of sections along with the transverse bulkheads. But it was also appreciated that, especially in ships that had tumblehome, if you had those kind of bulkheads, you ran the risk of having flooding occur and then all the flooding being concentrated on one side and then you roll over and sink. So there was discussion about either not having longitudinal bulkheads in certain places or having them with specific piercings to allow a degree of cross flooding, or even pumps that would specifically cross flood. But the idea essentially was then if you then took a bunch of flooding on one side, you could even it out, either naturally or artificially, and keep the ship on an even keel, just sitting a bit lower in the water. The compromise, of course, is that then you would be taking on a lot more water than you otherwise would do, and so no single solution was arrived at universally amongst ships that had a lot of tumblehome. GFDX asks, on page 61 of The Fleet That Fought Itself, it's mentioned that the nationalist battleship Espana was hit by a torpedo from a Republican submarine, but it was a dud. If it wasn't a dud, what would the effect have been? Would it have been enough to sink the ageing Espana? And how would nations, both Spain and others, have reacted? Would they look and point and go, ha, old stuff, not like our new shiny splendid stuff? Or would there be a mild panic about submarine versus capital ship danger? Well, I don't know exactly where she was hit, but given that the Espana, which is actually the second Espana, because the first Espana hit a rock and sank, this is actually the Alfonso the 13th, I believe, renamed to Espana. But in any case, given that she would subsequently be sunk by hitting a single mine, and given the fact that the Espana class are relatively small pre-World War I designed dreadnoughts built without much in the way of any underwater defences, I suspect that if the torpedo had hit anywhere other than the extreme bow of the ship, it probably would have done enough damage to sink it, because the submarine that launched it was the C4, amusingly enough named, but the Spanish C-class submarines had 21-inch torpedo tubes, so it would have been a fairly hefty warhead that would have hit it, and yeah, I think it would have blown through any of the relatively minor defences the ship had, put in a lot of flooding, and yeah, given the fact that a mine managed to sink it, a similarly sized warhead from a torpedo would also have been quite easily able to sink it. I don't think it would have massively concerned most of the other navies, simply again because she was a fairly small and weakly protected vessel by the standards of the time in which she was built, let alone by the late 1930s. So everyone would have gone, well, that's why you put anti-torpedo defences on, mate. And finally, for this week, RG asks, I've often heard you refer to British ships in reserve as ordinary. Why is it called ordinary? Obviously, searching for anything like Royal Navy ordinary returns a bunch of not particularly helpful results about averages and common things. So the term primarily refers to Royal Navy ships from the late early 1700s through to the end of the Age of Sail, although it does continue to be used for Royal Navy ships in reserve subsequent to that to a certain extent as a little bit of a colloquialism, and in the Age of Sail is also used to refer to other navies' ships in reserve these days, i.e. by current historians. They wouldn't necessarily have called it, well, they definitely wouldn't have called it that at the time. So a French fleet, for example, that was in reserve would not describe itself as in ordinary, because it is a very specific term that the Royal Navy came up with, and it all comes down to the way the Navy estimates were actually worked out originally in the classic Age of Sail. So when the Navy came to Parliament and said this is how much money we need for the year, then they would split that down into three large overall headings. You had the extraordinary estimate, which was for major rebuilding, major refit, battle damage repair, things out of the ordinary that you needed to pay for, but were essentially going to be one-offs that you wouldn't be asking for the same money for that same ship the next year. You then had the sea service estimate, which was, these are the ships that we have fully stocked and ready for sea or are currently at sea, and these are the costs of running those, which are of course above and beyond what you'd need just to maintain the vessel, because you need to supply food, you need to supply pay, you need to supply ammunition, powder, you have to do maintenance as they come back into dock, you might have to be paying other amounts out as they acquire bits and pieces that they need while they're out overseas, and then once coppering comes in, obviously you need to copper the ships to keep them nice and swift and not full of shipworm and things. And then the final one was the ordinary estimate, and that was the day-to-day running of the Navy. So the sea service estimate was an ongoing thing, and yes, it was understood you might well be asking for money for the same ship the next year in the sea service estimate, but that figure was always going to be changing, and eventually it would stop because the ship would stop being at sea. Whereas with the ordinary estimates, this was things like naval schools, dockyards, warehouses, etc., and ships in long-term reserve, because those were dependable year-on-year costs that shouldn't vary all that much and were necessary. And so when a ship moved from active service to what we these days call either reserve or mothballing, they were referred to as in ordinary because the ships appeared in the ordinary estimate as opposed to the sea service estimate. And then more specifically, in terms of putting a Royal Navy ship of the time into reserve, as you can see from this depiction, it's a little bit more of an involved step compared to perhaps a later steel vessel. So a ship would come up to a quayside and would unload its armament, hence why there's places like Gun Wharf Quays in Portsmouth. That's where armament would be offloaded to a ship going into ordinary or loaded onto a ship that was coming back out of reserve. You would also step down the masts to varying degrees, depending on exactly, how long it was going to go in and what procedure was at that particular time. You might be left with just the lower mast sections like you see here. You might have some basic yards up, some more basic rigging. This is a bit of more extreme. In some cases, you might not have any mast. They might step the mast out completely. Or in the case of a ship like Unicorn up in Dundee, which was never commissioned, she just spent her entire life in ordinary, the masts were never installed. And of course, because wooden ships tend to leak a little bit, especially up on deck when they're, got the hatches and everything, you would have some degree of temporary structure above. Now that could be tarps and awnings, it could be full-on lightweight wooden housing with fires or furnaces aboard to keep the maintenance crew warm, as you can see here with the Hastings. And ships would sit like this, theoretically undergoing periodic minor maintenance to check for rot and so forth, for years, possibly even decades at a time, before being brought back into service as and when they were needed. And that brings us to the end for this week's Dry Dock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.